I decided today to talk about Wadham and Wren. We're all kind of paying homage to Wadham and homage to Gresham College and homage to the characters we're talking about. I also took seriously that this is about the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society and the beginnings of science in the Royal Society. So I'm talking about Wren's early years, and I will actually give you my conclusions before I start, because I think it's always helpful when you're listening to a paper, which is that I got allocated Christopher Wren, Mike got allocated Robert Hooke, Michael Hunter could have got allocated Robert Boyle. But my argument is going to be, and it's in line with Michael Hunter's very nice paper this morning, that what particularly the scientists in the room should be listening for is that this is the period in which the methodologies and technologies of modern science emerged. And that because we're so accustomed to them in the West, we take them so for granted they are invisible, but that is what is being framed. And that does not consist in lone scientists working alone, if ever there were lone scientists. I mean, people talk about lone humanities scholars, they don't work alone either. But scientists, I don't believe, have ever worked alone, and the strategies whereby they combine, I'm going to be talking about how Wren fits into that. And then the other part of my argument is it was very nice of Mike Cooper to keep talking about Hooke and Wren in the surveying of London and the rebuilding of the city. And of course there are the buildings, which are at least sketched on the backs of envelopes by Wren. But Wren did not believe in publication, and this is the second strand of the history of science. He was too posh to believe in publication. That runs right way through from the Renaissance to the 19th century. And he was too busy as Royal Surveyor, and he also, in the light of his father's experience, Dean of Windsor, the catastrophe for him of the collapse of the Royalist regime in the civil wars, he did not trust paper. He says over and over again in his life that it is buildings that will withstand the passage of time. He had watched papers that his father had collected assiduously be burned. He'd watched what a civil war produces, as we know from our modern day, is the destruction of books and manuscripts. And so you have two things with Wren. You have the non-existence of the data, actually, for the friendship, the working partnership of Hooke and Wren, because Wren didn't write any of it down. Wren didn't publish the books on his science. I'm going to say to you he is a major scientist, but I'm also going to show that the way that his science intersects with Gresham College and the early Royal Society is what we should be paying attention to. I've probably used most of my time by that, right? Yeah, I thought I should start with Wren. Yes, I really did think I'd start with Portrait of Wren, which is my favourite portrait of Wren because it doesn't look like that silly one you usually see, but actually it's based on a death mark, so, right. But here we are again with Wilkins, and a quote I'm going to start with from the Hartlib papers. They are now erecting a college for experiments and mechanics at Oxford, towards which Dr. Wilkin hath given £200. It is over the schools or in the long gallery, where all the models of inventions, arts, etc. are to be reserved, with a treatise added to each of them, showing the structure and use of it. They desire Greatorex to be the keeper of that college. End of quote. In the second half of the 17th century in England, a procession of great figures emerged to become the founding figures of modern science, what was then called natural philosophy. Today, it is the originality of these, quote, men of genius that we are inclined to celebrate, particularly if we're Alan Yentov. Yet the most innovative aspect of the period's scientific activities was a whole series of collaborative intellectual enterprises which were unlike any that came before them in their capacity to mobilize and organize original ideas and their technical application. Anyone who visited Dr. John Wilkins in the 1650s was struck by the unusual and productive way in which he had managed to orchestrate the activities of a group or club of brilliant individuals he had brought together at Wadham College. And we heard from Mike a little about the structure of that organization. I didn't know that before. I want the reference afterwards, please, Mike. In spite of the tendency of these visitors to want to attribute what they were shown to individual prodigies, like the adolescent Wren, It is apparent that it was the Oxford group under Wilkins's direction which was responsible for the technological successes at Wadham. Indeed, what is striking when we consult the 17th century records, the books, letters and documents which provide us with the history of this intellectually crucial period, that with what regularity individuals like Boyle, Halley, Hooke, Petty, Wren, even the famously reclusive Newton at this point in his life, point to collaborative effort, shared data collection, and the hands-on involvement of others as the catalyst for their originality, stimulating theoretical or technological breakthrough. And in Mike's lovely paper, we saw how that collaborative methodology also worked for the practical applied scientific surveying of London, just as in Ireland, William Petty was applying it to the measuring of Ireland. Today, taking as my example the precocious scientific talent of Sir Christopher Wren, I want to propose that it was the organizational infrastructure, working arrangements, procedures and attitudes of 17th century science, every bit as much as its pioneering theories and experiments, which made the breakthrough to modern scientific understanding in theory and in practice possible. Specifically, I want to argue that the vision of Dr. John Wilkins, later Bishop of Chester, was the inspiration not simply of the Royal Society, but for, big claim, the entire so-called scientific revolution in England. The model for progress in the new experimental sciences, I maintain, was a network of young and talented, skilled practitioners, coordinated and driven by the vision of a charismatic program planner and organizer. John Wilkins was the archetypal such visionary. In the elegantly written preface to his groundbreaking book on microscopy, which we've referred to many times today, Micrographia, or some physiological descriptions of minute bodies, published in London under the imprimatur of the new Royal Society in 1665, the virtuoso experimenter, inventor and polymath Robert Hooke pays lengthy tribute to the vital role John Wilkins had played in nurturing and developing not just his own talents, but those of the entire circle of 17th century English virtuosi. Without Wilkins, he wrote, his own investigations of nature would have led him nowhere, and this, he said, was true for most contemporary English innovators. There is scarce, he writes, any one invention which this nation has produced in our age, but it has some way or other been set forward by his assistance. Without Wilkins's guidance and encouragement, Hooke maintains, he would never have seen how to advance his ideas in observational science, nor have had the opportunity to pursue them in the first place. And his exquisite engraved line drawings of natural phenomena as viewed under the new microscope would never have seen publication. Hooke makes one further claim in his preface to Micrographia concerning Wilkins's involvement in his decision to make and illustrate a book-length series of observations using the new microscope. And this is the one that I want particularly you to pay attention to. It was Wilkins, Hooke tells his reader, who persuaded him to, quote, follow in the footsteps of Christopher Wren, another, slightly older protege of Wilkins's, who had, with Wilkins's guidance, undertaking the, quote, first beginnings in microscopical drawings of this kind. For Wilkins, it was the project that mattered. Any one of his gifted young practitioners might be substituted for another. With Wren now too busy to complete this particular project, it was, Hooke tells us, Wilkins's decision to substitute the younger man himself with comparable drafting skills. And I quote, at last, being ensured both by Dr. Wilkins and Dr. Wren himself that he had given over his intentions of prosecuting it, and not finding that there was any else designed the pursuing of it, I set upon this undertaking. In his own day, Wilkins's was a name to conjure with internationally in influential intellectual circles, and his was a palpable presence in London, determining the shape of a whole range of important initiatives that we've heard about today. He was charming, intelligent, and well-connected. He was gregarious, curious, and an enthusiastic networker. In the words delivered by one of the royal chaplains at his funeral, he had an understanding that extended to all parts of useful learning and knowledge, a will always disposed to great and public and generous things. In great matters he judged so well, he was not usually surprised with events. I take that to be he was an operator. The claim that Wilkins empowered a generation of brilliant innovators by encouraging group inquiry and information sharing is, on the face of it, a reasonably uncontroversial one, though I do stress for you that way in which the substitution process one of these boys would do for any of the others, if they could do the job. We can understand it clearly in the context of astronomy, where the habit began early of pooling observational data collected in locations at considerable distances apart as the basis for tables establishing the regular movements of celestial bodies and supporting generalized theories about them. But I'm talking of more than data collection here. The interactions I'm proposing took place at the level of shared engagement in experimental activity over extended periods of time to a pre-arranged program under the guidance of what amounted to a gifted research professor. What is more difficult for the historian is to demonstrate Wilkins at work in any leadership capacity. And that, I just leave you with that. Bracket that to one side. Wilkins may have been the mover. I mean, it's not at all clear to me that he had the kind of ability that his Dr. Wilkins's boys had, but he could identify them. Fortunately, by unearthing occasional references in the surviving records, we can follow the progress of some members of the Oxford Circle who later rose to positions of prominence themselves as they developed under Wilkins's organizing influence. And the example I'm focusing on here is Christopher Wren. So I'm now going back a little in the life of Christopher Wren. In 1647, so this is the Civil War period, Christopher Wren, later part of the Wadham group, part of a team experimenting with manned flight under the direction of Wilkins, as Alan Chapman told us this morning. That's what he would do at Wadham, was having prior experience working on the action of muscles, something that Wilkins also ran as a team project at Wadham, as assistant to the physician Sir Charles Scarborough, when he was briefly employed as his junior technician and amanuensis. I've had to leave out most of the data here, but Charles Scarborough, as a royalist, was exiled to his country estates and got into telescopes and also got into physiological experimenting and hired from Wren's father, they'd fallen on hard times, his son Christopher, or at least took him in as a house guest to help him work on these topics. The point about these topics is that the Scarborough topics are then transferred to Wadham and worked on by the group in Wadham. In the mid-1650s, Wilkins provided the working environment, proposed the program of research, and brought together expertise from a number of quarters, as well as the prior experience with practical experimenting in a particular field. And he created team projects on the basis of the accumulated and assembled experience of the individuals. That paragraph isn't very clear. He's hoping for, just ending here, hoping for improved outcomes and successes. What that paragraph is supposed to say, if it hadn't been so compacted, is that these individuals who've worked in various locations on topics that are specified, I can track those topics as transferring to the Wadham Circle. So they are brought in with some of their data by these young protégés, and then the team sets to work on them. They then become the team's projects, but I'm just going to describe to you that they can be reassigned to individuals when they need a job. I know I can't digress, but it's just what we do today. When you write a reference for a graduate student, you specify some beautiful piece of work that they have already done, which you know they're doing in your group, but you take it out and allocate it to them, because that gives the sort of imprimatur again to get them the job. You don't really mean they did it. You mean we all did it, but okay, you can watch this. I'll show you. But I need first to tell you how Wren and Wilkins knew one another. This is Windsor Castle. You can see it's Windsor Castle. The Wren-Wilkins relationship had been formed at a moment of national crisis when Wren was literally a boy. When Charles I's trial was imminent and his fate virtually sealed at the end of 1648, Wilkins, who had served since 1642 as chaplain to Charles Louis, Elector Palatine, eldest son of Charles I's sister Elizabeth, took steps to ensure that he could take advantage of his Palatine connection in case he needed to flee the country. So if you get that. So Wilkins sees the writing on the wall, sees the King's party is going to lose, forms his connection with Charles Louis, Elector Palatine, who will be allowed to leave the country. He's in England at that moment. He will be allowed to leave whatever happens because he's a foreign national. Between late December 1648 and January 1649, when you know the King is executed, Wilkins shuttled between Oxford and London, negotiating successfully to obtain a position in the retinue of Charles Louis, who was scheduled to return to the Palatine territories that had been reassigned to him by the treaty at the end of the 30 Years' War the previous year. His preparations included getting Wren a position in Charles Louis's household. Wilkins brought Wren to the elector's attention via a letter requesting patronage for his young protege, and that letter survives. The letter that got Wren into the party with Wilkins that was allowed to leave the country, something Wren never dwelt on later in his life, but which I now consider I have proved, me and the head of the royal palaces, the English heritage between us. Wren's letter to the Elector Palatine allows us to glimpse Wilkins working in his capacity as a research director. In this case, he masterminds the allocation of credit for originality in respect of specific pieces of technology developed by his research team. It was, wrote Wren to his benefactor, it's Wren writing the letter, it was, wrote Wren, his benefactor and mentor Wilkins, who had insisted that he must claim for himself and offer to his hoped-for patron, Charles Louis, 2 devices or pieces of technology, and they are described in papers that were attached to the letter, to whose successful development he is saying, and he is saying on Wilkins's say-so, he has made important technical contributions. One is a mechanical seed drill for sowing corn evenly and without waste, and the other is a duplicate writing machine which will make a perfect copy of a handwritten document as it was written. In other words, a sort of early Xerox machine. The 2 papers that Wren presented to Charles Louis describe inventions on which we can see the Wilkins group working collaboratively for several years. They crop up repeatedly in the Hartlib papers that I referred to again at the beginning, which is a collection of papers by Samuel Hartlib of scientific work that's being done across the country. And these 2 things, the double writing instrument and the mechanical seed drill, crop up over and over again, assigned to different individuals. It might be argued they were not Wilkins's to assign to the young Wren, but if Wilkins regarded himself as the official head of the organized group developing the seed drill and the double writing machine, and was providing the funding and direction, he may have considered it reasonable to exploit his stake in these potentially lucrative inventions when lobbying on Wren's behalf. Because some people in the room will know that it was William Petty, of whom I haven't unfortunately got a picture, who is regarded as the owner, if you like. Both the seed drill and the double writing machine are generally attributed to William Petty. He had been responsible for bringing early prototypes of both engines into the Oxford Club. So just as Wren brought in the Scarborough Muscles work and brought in some of the flying machine work, so Petty had brought in the seed drill and the double writing machine. He'd brought them into the Oxford Club. He'd taken this is Petty, he'd taken an active role in their development, successfully applying for patents speculatively for each of them in his own name. That's why we know Petty claimed them. There are patents in his name. In July 1648, Hartlib records in the Hartlib papers that Petty has taken out a patent on a mechanical sewing machine whose technical features are a significant improvement on earlier designs, and I'm saying it's the Oxford group that has done that development work. In late February 1649, Hartlib reports that Petty's agriculture instrument has been really and sufficiently tested. By the middle of that year, Hartlib had further news about the trials, and particularly the fact that it could be marketed in such a way that its machinery could not be copied. The following September, Hartlib noted that Petty was once again going down to the country, quote, to try his engine for corn business. Let's skip a bit here. So, shall I just summarize this? Okay, no, I won't. I'll read a bit. All right, I'm rushing.
No, it's good stuff.
Ian, thank you. It seems that Petty lodged the patent for his sewing machine, then took the problem to the Oxford Group for team development, first under his own direction and subsequently under Wilkins's. The mechanically able Christopher Wren, who is much the youngest of this group, was allocated to the project for research and development. Hence Wren's appearance working on precisely the ventures which interested Petty, and hence their being attributed to him in a job application to Charles Lewis, Elector Palatine. The trials, however, apparently ran into difficulties. In the spring of 1651, a member of the Oxford Group, John Liddell, reported to his ex-pupil John Aubrey in London that the engine was still not yet altogether completed. In Liddell's letter, both Petty's and Wren's name are associated with the new engines on which the group is working. And I quote, "Here have been some late inventions with us of some new engines, one how to set a field of corn as soon as otherwise it can be sown and harrowed, invented by Dr. Petty. Another is how, with the same weights to weigh grains and scruples and drams and ounces, both the scale and weights hanging slide on at an equal distance from the centre of the balance, invented by Mr. Wren, a Bachelor of Arts of Wadham, who likewise invented another engine for double writing." And what I'm trying to capture is, if you go through the Hartlib papers, if you go through other documents in this period, what for a long while I found so puzzling was these same two inventions cropping up over and over again, attributed to different people at different levels of completion, different patents being lodged. And the only way I can make sense of this now is to attribute them to Wilkins's Oxford Group and watch how all the people who claim them are associated with the Oxford Group and, if you like, dispersing outwards to plum jobs elsewhere in the intellectual community over the course of the period. When Petty reported on the corn engine to London Virtuosi in the same year, he too referred to it as our project, thereby again acknowledging the shared nature of the undertaking. And his account also, this is Petty, who after all has the patents, his account makes it clear that Wilkins is seen as the group organiser. "I have lately had several relations from Oxford concerning the fruits of our corn engine, both by writing and word of mouth, whereof one writeth that Mr. Warden Wilkins should say such a quantity of corn to be on the ground as, if so, makes the increase of what was sown 120 to 1. I think there is little danger in modesty to infer that the engine doth without dispute save 3/4 of the seed." That's what this drill engine is about. It's about drilling and dropping the seed in simultaneously, whereas broadcast scattering, you lose half the seed, which is taken up by birds on the surface. So there's pictures of this instrument in Petty's works. You have a thing that trundles along, making holes and dropping seed into the hole you've just made. And we're being told here, big claim, 120-fold improvement in yield. So Wilkins took advantage of his key position in the Oxford Group to attribute the seed drill and the double writing instrument to Wren in his patronage-seeking letter, assigning him, as it were, the intellectual property temporarily, to ensure that his skills looked especially attractive to his potential patent. We can see that Wilkins considers himself to be entitled to orchestrate the inventive efforts of his gifted colleagues, although in this case, Petty, who had anticipated lucrative profits, continued later to contest Wren's claims to both. So once it became a question of money and going into production, then problems arose. Actually, neither of them did go into production. That's just an example. Petty dedicated the published account of his double writing machine to Robert Boyle. And here we're bringing Boyle in again. This is my way of introducing Boyle. Youngest son of the Earl of Cork. Boyle, recently settled in England from Ireland, I think I have got Boyle, already had a reputation for using his considerable wealth to support scientific projects. In his dedication, Petty identifies Boyle as the ideal intellectual backer because he has both the funds and participates in the ventures he undertakes. Petty, in other words, asked for Boyle to take a role again as directing research. I haven't bothered to read you that quote. And Wilkins evidently had the same idea, and Wilkins does indeed, as we heard from Michael Hunter, actually solicit Boyle to join the group, to join the research team, both as backer and practitioner. And that is effectively, I love the fact that Michael said that that was at the peak of Boyle's scientific career. Probably that's so. But of course, it's also the beginning of his a lifelong position as a scientific Maecenas, patron or funder or backer. On the 14th of September 1655, we're now in the middle of the interregnum, in the middle of the Oxford group being at work, Boyle wrote to Hartlib that he had visited Wilkins in Oxford, with whom I spent a day with no small satisfaction. Wilkins introduced him to members of the club and showed him his garden, where Boyle saw Indian wheat and nasturtiums growing, which flowers, he says, make excellent salads. He was also shown Wren's transparent beehive, and reported that although 2 of the 3 stories of the hive were functioning well, the third was nothing near so well replenished, which did somewhat disconcert the doctor. The hive did function well, though, in allowing visitors to watch the bees at work inside. So these are transparent glass panels. And according to other descriptions, and Jim Bennett knows more about this than me, I think Wren had put little sculptural figures all over his beehive. I mean, he was a precocious adolescent, beautiful boy was Wren at this point. So his beehive didn't just look like that. That's just the practicalities. It apparently had little classical figures all over it. What Wren and Wilkins shared with others in the Wadham group, like Hooke and Petty, was a burning desire to create a future which would allow them to forget the chaos of the 1640s and the 1650s. Their passionate commitment to new technology stemmed from the belief that human nature was so fundamentally flawed that no man alone could hope to survive in turbulent, unpredictable times. Only through meticulously organized collaboration might groups of talented individuals recover sufficient understanding to improve the lot of humankind. As Wilkins wrote in the sermon delivered in 1649, in the period immediately following Charles I's execution, we may infer how all that confusion and disorder which seems to be in the affairs of these times is not so much in things themselves as in our mistake of them. So to conclude with my starting conclusion, subsequent to this period, although people talk now of Wren as a scientist, and you know that is entirely due to Jim Bennett. Where is Jim? Up there. To Jim Bennett's doctoral thesis book on Wren as a scientist, from which I pillaged, shamelessly for my biography of Christopher Wren. Up until that point, Wren was not described as a scientist. He was described as an architect. Now, Wren was over 30 when he became an architect. I think it's interesting in connection with Mike's talking about Hooke at 30, taking on the rebuilding of London. 30 is peak maturity, right? Read 50 today, I reckon. You're at the height of your powers when longevity was not, or Wren was actually going to live till he was 90, but he didn't know that. At the height of his powers, he becomes an architect. He commits himself to non-publishing. He commits himself to buildings that he says will last against the ravages of time, and not the paper trails, which of course we historians need if we're to produce Wren as the lasting scientist. We see him, he crops up here, there and everywhere. He's always taking scientific observation. His name is in the margins. He does, of course, act as president of the Royal Society. But the fact is we don't have the data, the historical material, on which to reconstruct his later life as a scientist. But for the first 30 years, first within the Oxford group, and then moving, with the Oxford group, with the Oxford group, and then briefly with Gresham College. Wren is the scientist in the group, the Oxford group, and it isn't the individual Christopher Wren, it's one of Wilkins's boy wonders. The organisation of Wilkins's Wadham Club, under his own charismatic leadership, was his way of endeavouring to restore order to the confusion and disorder which seems to be in the affairs of these times. As it turned out, it was also the key to scientific progress and the foundation for a scientific practice which paved the way to modernity. It's an irony that would not have been lost on the Warden of Wadham that his strategy for correcting the mistakes that had led to civil war and regicide in England should have produced another seismic change, another overturning of the existing order, the scientific revolution. Thank you.